Okay, we are tackling ISO and exposure compensation. We kept this one for last because it's like the least important. If you notice on your camera, you won't ever have an ISO priority setting. You only ever have an aperture or shutter speed priority because ISO is generally just the balancer between those last or those other two. But it's going to make sure that everything is compensated. What ISO stands for is just the International Organization for Standards, meaning that when we talk about like camera settings, we all speak the same lingo. Now, like when I say, oh, I have my camera at ISO 400, shutter speed 1/250, and an aperture of f6.3, we all know what I'm talking about at this point. And you probably now understand what I'm talking about too. But what ISO is and how you can measure it. So in your camera, it is these 100 numbers, and 100 is your native sensitivity in your camera, meaning it's the lowest sensitivity your camera can go down to. If you get fancy cameras, you can get like 50 and 25, but they always are like half or whole numbers. But if my camera needs to be more sensitive to light, like let's say there's not a light that I'm working with, I can turn my ISO up to 200 and make it more sensitive to the light to try to read it and record it. Or I can turn it up to 400 or 800 or 16 or so and so and so. But you're probably wondering, like, why wouldn't I just want to keep it in these higher ISOs? So these higher ISOs are good for low light situations. Like if you were shooting at like a dance or something, or maybe a assembly when the lights are low in the auditorium. But the example is when you move from 100 to 200, your picture isn't becoming more bright because you're letting more light in. Your picture's becoming bright because you're making your camera more sensitive to light. So we have to be thinking about our aperture and our shutter. So our aperture is the opening, letting light in. Our shutter is how much time the shutter is open to allow the light in. And lastly is the sensor, which is the last thing to get the light, is how sensitive do we want that sensor to be the light. When you guys shoot in those auto ISOs, which we have been shooting in auto ISO, I told you to shoot in auto ISO. It keeps it between 100 and generally 16 to 3200. And we'll very rarely get into the 6400s. But we talked about like car people, why car people like manual cars over automatic cars is because they like that control, and I can make a better decision than a machine can. So when I want the control, I want to pick, I can choose this. Like let's say I want really good picture quality, but I wanted to do a landscape, which a landscape is a big f-stop number, small opening, and maybe I didn't have a tripod so I can't stabilize it. So I have to do a slightly faster shutter speed. All of these things I keep in mind. But generally, we don't ever want to, like, you never want to be in the higher ISOs unless it's needed. So here's an example of what will happen to your picture if you shoot in the higher ISOs. So this is, especially in the 64 and 12,800, you're going to see this thing called noise or grain or fuzziness. It's like pixelated. That is because the camera's working with such little light. It just is trying to collect whatever it can grasp. But if there's lots of light, we can have a good clear picture quality, like in the 100 to 800. About 1600 is about when you're going to start seeing some grain in those lighter areas. And especially on like a portrait, some people really hate grain, some people really like grain. It's kind of a personal preference. It will give on a film effect, but if you shoot in a higher ISO, there's no way for you to take away the grain or the noise, but I can always add grain in after the fact. So here's a rule to go by. Whatever your highest ISOs are, you generally try to never use those. So for us, those are our 3200, our 6400. So we try to avoid using those as much as we can. When you guys have that auto ISO, it's going to keep it in those lower ISOs. So once we're done with our exposure unit, we'll do auto ISO. But for the sake of practicing, you will not. But there are times where you're going to have to use a high ISO. Like, it's just unavoidable. Like, let's say something is moving fast. Like, Bigfoot is stepping off of a, thing. Like, he's a big object. He's going to move fast, so I have to have a higher shutter speed. A UFO talking with Tupac and Elvis, so I'm going to want to show the UFO and the people in the scenery, so I want a bigger f-stop number. And then because it's dark, I definitely need a higher ISO. So all of these things are factoring into, okay, my picture quality is going to go down because I've got a bigger f-stop number, smaller opening, fast shutter speed, not allowing a lot of light into our camera, and then a sensitive sensor. When you use the different ISOs though, so when you use 100 is when you want the best picture quality imaginable, meaning you can blow this picture up to be ginormous, like billboard size, and it will have no grain whatsoever. Generally, you use ISO 100 on landscape photography when your camera's on a tripod and your subject's not moving. ISO 200 is when you can't use a tripod for like landscape photography. ISO 400 is when you use sports photography because those objects are moving fast. You're going to have to use a faster shutter speed. So if you remember, fast moving humans are like, the shutter speed is 1/1000. So therefore we would need to have 400 as our ISO. And then if we look at our depth of field in this picture, it's pretty low, meaning I have a low f-stop number, a bigger opening. When you use different ISOs, so about 100 is about the highest you will want to go before you start seeing noise. At 1600, you're going to start seeing some noise. Like, let me zoom in. Right about right there in the lighter areas. You can see some grain and some noise. And some people, like I said, don't like that. Some people do. Definitely I can see some noise right here in the 3200s. But like something like a concert where people are moving fast and you want to show a good depth of field, like this is definitely not an F like high 20s. This is probably like an F like 18. But still, that's a small opening. And people are moving fast, not a lot of light, so therefore I have 3200. 6400, you definitely can't enlarge this photo at all because it's just going to be basically a bunch of pixels. Things to write down, so this is super important. What you need to write down. So optimum picture quality, low ISO. So generally, always try to keep your ISO as low as possible. The higher ISOs are going to be high sensitivity for low light, meaning it can pick up on a little bit of light. That's how you do like those star images, is a little bit of light, but it's high sensitive to that light. But technicality things and some guidelines for us to be aware of. So one, like I mentioned, keep it as low as possible, but you will have to raise your ISO for a faster shutter speed or a bigger depth of field. So if I go a fast shutter speed, like anything over 1/250, I'm gonna have to raise my ISO. If I'm gonna go a bigger depth of field picture, a bigger f-stop number, I'm going to have to raise my ISO. Now you're probably wondering, how do we know if all three of these things are working together? And that is what in our camera we call metering. So you might have noticed this, you might have not. If you haven't, it's fine. But metering is on the top of your camera, and we're going to show you how to do this when I get back. But on the screen of your camera as well, there's this meter, where it's measuring from -3 to +3. And this is in your eye viewfinder and on your LCD viewfinder. And this little rectangle right here will move depending on what our settings are at and what type of light that we are working with as well. So if our picture is too dark, meaning we can't see anything, it's like all black, it would be over here. If we have too much light coming in and it's all white, our square would be over here. And this we can meter by using our shutter button, our picture button. We just have to press it down halfway. So we are going to practice this idea of using all three of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and this idea of metering in a very controlled format called your Canon Play, which you'll move on to next.